let me just, and let's just wait a few seconds until it's exactly 7 o'clock. We're just a few seconds away. Okay, it's 7 o'clock now. Good evening. My name is Rob Lorei, and I'm the host managing editor for Florida This Week on WEDU TV, and I will be your moderator. The state attorney is responsible for conducting legal proceedings against individuals charged with crimes that occur in the judicial circuit. It's the job of the state attorney to review charges and complaints to determine whether the facts warrant prosecution. The state attorney's office for the 6th Judicial Circuit serves a population of more than 1.5 million people across Pinellas and Pasco counties, staffed by a team of more than 450 employees. I want to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Pinellas and Greater Tampa Bay chapters of the ACLU of Florida, League of Women Voters chapters in St. Petersburg and North Pinellas, as well as the Pasco unit of the Hillsborough County League, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the NAACP Clearwater Upper Branch County, Pinellas County branch, and the NAACP St. Petersburg branch and the St. Petersburg Bar Association. These groups have helped formulate the questions, and they did take a few suggestions for questions from outside, from people in the community. The voter registration deadline is October 11th for the November 8th election. If you plan to mail in your ballot, please mail it at least 2 weeks before November 8th. You can request a mail ballot by visiting your County Supervisor of Elections website or calling their office. We're going to go over the ground rules for the forum. The program tonight will consist of questions to both candidates. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for their reply. At the conclusion of the questions, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. The order for closing statement was chosen by flipping a coin. And now let's meet the candidates, candidate Bruce Bartlett and candidate Allison Miller. And we're going to start our first question to candidate Bartlett. And the first question is, and again, you have 2 minutes for this. In the past 3 years, there has been a movement across the country by some state attorney's offices to build a conviction integrity unit to address wrongful convictions. The 6th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office is not among them. What is your position on a CIU for our circuit? And please explain your answer.
In our office, we have an appellate unit that handles all post-conviction cases that come before us. In the process of doing that, there are issues that are raised where there are allegations made by defendants as to whether or not they feel that they were guilty or innocent, keeping them innocent. Keeping in mind at this particular point in time when they are in post-conviction status, the case has already been tried, the person has been convicted, and it has been on appeal, and it has been reviewed by that appellate court and found to be a sound quality on the conviction. In spite of that, in our appellate unit, we continue to explore and investigate allegations made by defendants and find out whether or not they have any validity to them in line with what went on with the case. They result in periodically where you have sentences that are the wrong sentence that was put on the judgment and sentence, or there are other modifications. Sometimes there's evidence that needs to be explored by way of an evidentiary hearing, and we do that. So the fact that we don't have a conviction integrity unit, that's more of just a kind of political name sign of the times. We have the ability to do that, and we do that as we go along. I've long believed that if we have quality people on the front end who are doing the investigations and that are preparing the cases and that are trying the cases and are following their obligations as prosecutors, ethical obligations, that you have less problems on the back end. It's when you don't have those qualities that exist, then you start running into trouble on the back end. So it's not that we don't have a conviction integrity unit, but we do have a comparable standard that is being looked at through our appellate sections.
All right, candidate Bartlett, thank you. Candidate Miller, do you want me to read the question again, or do you want to just take it?
My opinion on having a conviction integrity unit?
Yes.
I am hugely in favor and intend to instate a conviction integrity unit should I get elected. I think Mr. Bartlett's answer demonstrates his lack of understanding of the function of a conviction integrity unit. I don't dispute that better prosecutions on the front end ensure better validity of our results and our convictions, but people are inherently fallible. And so expecting infallible results from fallible people is unrealistic. We have all seen over the course of the last 30 years the evolution in forensic evidence, particularly as it pertains to DNA evidence, and how many people have been exonerated who confessed, who were convicted based on eyewitness testimony, and those folks were later exonerated based on forensic evidence that clearly indicated that person was not the perpetrator. And I think what not having a conviction integrity unit, what we are failing to contemplate by not having that is it's a gross injustice to not have the guilty perpetrators incarcerated for the crimes. But by having the innocent in prison, that means the guilty go free. Right. And so we watched in Hillsborough County, Andrew Warren's conviction review unit not only exonerate Robert Dubose, but then Andrew Warren's conviction integrity unit or conviction review unit, went on to solve the rapes and murders of Barbara Grahams and Linda Lanson. If it wasn't for that investigative work, those cases would have never been solved. And I heard Linda Lanson's niece speak at the press conference wherein she and Andrew Warren were discussing after 40 years, the rape and murder of her aunt being solved and it giving the gift of calm to her family.
Thank you, Candidate Miller. The next question goes to Candidate Miller. What is the role of the state attorney in protecting the broad privacy rights given by the Florida Constitution with regards to reproductive health decisions?
Well, that's certainly topical. It's interesting because as the state attorney, you put your hand on a Bible and swear to uphold both the constitutions of the United States of America and of the state of Florida. And any law that's deemed to be unconstitutional has to be passed by our lawmakers first, right? Before a court can say that law was unconstitutional, our lawmakers made it a law. And so our lawmakers passed a 15-week abortion ban this legislative session. A trial court at the state level, a trial judge within the state system has said that law is unconstitutional because Florida actually has stricter privacy protections in its constitution than even the United States Constitution. The governor has appealed that decision to an appellate court called the First District Court of Appeal. And while the case is on appeal, that 15-week abortion ban is in place. But the only ruling regarding the abortion ban in Florida right now is that it's unconstitutional. And if precedent is interpreted consistently as it has been in the past, that stricter privacy protection that the Florida Constitution provides would deem that the Florida Constitution's privacy protections have been interpreted by other courts to protect a woman's right to have an abortion, access to reproductive health care. And so if law is interpreted consistently, the 15-week abortion ban will be deemed unconstitutional. I believe my job as the state attorney is to protect the community. And I certainly don't think that's well served prosecuting women or healthcare providers who either provide or help their patients get what is medically necessary.
Thank you. Candidate Bartlett, if you want, I'll repeat the question or you
All
can.
right, that'll be fine.
Okay, the question is, what is the role of the state attorney in protecting the broad privacy rights given by the Florida Constitution with regards to reproductive health decisions?
The role of state attorney, Rob, is to follow the laws that are made by the legislature in Tallahassee. We do not make the laws, we enforce the laws. As it pertains to abortion, they came back this year. They did tighten the controls on it, but there's still the ability of an individual to get an abortion. They just have to do it within the first trimester of that pregnancy. So it's not like it doesn't exist. The fact that it's on appeal, that the judge has made a preliminary ruling, we'll see what happens at the end of the day. But the problem is we're in dangerous times right now in this world. The people in different pockets of the areas of the country have become elected officials like state attorneys and they have decided that they are going to do whatever they think is the right thing to do and not follow the laws that have been passed by the people of those communities that live there. And the simple fact of the matter is we have people who are elected to do that. The voters have put them there. They've made the decisions that that's what the law is going to be. And that is what the prosecutors enforce. It's not the job of the prosecutor to go in and decide that he or she is going to do what their personal opinion feels that they should do. We know these things. We've seen it happen in several communities throughout the country. Look at Los Angeles, look at San Francisco, for heaven's sakes, look at Seattle, look at New York, where the laws have not been uniformly enforced, even though they are on the books. And that has led to a very, very bad situation. San Francisco, they recalled the prosecutor and took him away so he couldn't be the prosecutor anymore because crime was rampant. It was just a lawless society that existed. And the laws are made by the legislature. There's a process in place. If we don't have the laws and we don't have the uniform enforcement of the laws, then we don't have order. We don't have anything. We don't have well-being. And that's what the thing is all about, is following the law.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question is for you, candidate Bartlett. Would you support balancing public safety with the defendant's right to an affordable bail through alternatives to traditional monetary bail? Please explain your answer to our audience.
I think right now we have in place a very, very good screening process that exists. The sheriff's office, when the people are booked into the jail, efforts are made to find a way to let them be ROR'd out, depending on if there's an ankle monitor attached or not like that. The simple fact of the matter is there are cases in which people really should be held at bay and put back in jail. They have prior records. They have committed heinous, atrocious offenses. They need to be there. So I think the system as it is in place right now works just fine. We're not having any problems with the situation. And the people that have been arrested that are in jail, they have an opportunity within a very short period of time to ask that judge and petition for a bail that they feel that they can make, and the judge rules on that decision. And likewise, later on in the case, if factors change, they can come in again, make their motions to do that. But there's a certain sense of safety when these individuals are not out on the street being able to commit crimes again. We see in our juvenile system where the kids come in, they're basically booked through in the juvenile center, and within a matter of hours, they're back out doing the same thing they were doing when they were put in there. And it's a fact. We've seen it, and it happens, and it continues to happen. That's my position.
Okay, thank you. And again, let me just say as a blanket thing, I will be happy to read the question again, or you can just launch into an answer to the question when it's your turn. Candidate Miller.
Well, I tend to pontificate, so I'm going to ask you the question again, so I know that I'm answering what you're asking.
Okay, so this question is, would you support balancing public safety with the defendant's right to an affordable bail through alternatives to traditional monetary bail? Please explain your answer to our audience.
Yes, the short answer is yes. I heard Mr. Bartlett say there's no problems with the current system. There have been moments over the course of the last several years that have really reinforced why I'm doing what it is that I'm doing. And one of which was a gentleman by the name of Alfred Woodard died in our jail in February of 2021. He was incarcerated for 2 misdemeanor crimes for stealing from Walmart. He had stolen a small amount of personal goods and had been previously trespassed from Walmart. And the judge at first appearances or advisories actually raised his bail amount. And then subsequent to that, Mr. Woodard died in our jail. And so certainly I don't think that people have the right to steal from Walmart. And I understand this gentleman had somewhat of a more prolific criminal history as it relates to minor petty type crimes. And so when we talk about balancing public safety, obviously no one thinks it's okay to steal. However, I think most people would agree that that man did not deserve a life or death sentence for those crimes. And I hear Mr. Bartlett talk about following the law. The law actually favors releasing a defendant on his or her own recognizance for low-level nonviolent crime. The secondary bail amount or bail consideration is what we call non-secure bail, where a person is released, and then if that person fails to appear, he or she actually owes the court system money. And then only finally do we resort to cash bail for low-level nonviolent crimes. We almost never follow the law as it applies to bail in this system, in this circuit, and I intend to make sure that we do if I'm elected.
All right, thank you. This next question goes to candidate Miller first. Floridians voted to restore the right to vote to people with felony convictions with 2018's Amendment 4, but the implementation has led to confusion, arrests, and prosecutions. How will your office distinguish between willful election violations and mistakes that lead to improper registrations?
Right. Well, in any crime, most any crime, I'll say, the government is required to prove criminal intent to prove the crime, right? And so you sort of nailed that exactly, is that the voters in this state overwhelmingly passed Amendment 4, allowing for automatic reenfranchisement, someone who has served his or her sentence to be able to vote upon completion of the sentence, right? Which I think most of us as voters interpreted to mean an incarcerative sentence. Our legislature then took that a step further and said completion of sentence means all of it. So it's not just the incarcerative portion. An offender has to repay all fines, fees, court cost, and restitution to be able to reenfranchise or to be able to vote. And so there are some types of convictions that a person is never going to be eligible for reenfranchisement if that person has been convicted of murder or certain sex crimes. And my understanding of the 20 defendants who have been, round up as part of some political stunt by the governor is that all of them registered to vote and were issued voter registration cards by the state of Florida. And so certainly none of them had, and my understanding is that all of them had disqualifying convictions so that they were never going to be eligible for reenfranchisement, even with full payment of fine, fees, and court costs because of the nature of their convictions. And some of them, my understanding is the government actually sought out aiding them in registering to vote while they were still incarcerated. And so I think we would all question what the criminal intent was of those people who signed up to register and were given voter registration cards. And so my ethical obligation is, as the state attorney, is only to prosecute crimes I can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And if I can't prove someone's criminal intent, then I can't prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, and I'm not going to prosecute that person.
Thank you. Candidate Bartlett, do you want to answer the question or you want me to read it again?
Say it again, Rob.
Okay, here we go. So Floridians voted to restore the right to vote to people with felony convictions in 2018's Amendment 4. But the implementation has led to confusion, arrests, and prosecutions. How will your office distinguish between willful election violations and mistakes that lead to improper registrations?
Well, actually, we have cases in the office right now, not many, but there are cases where people have voted twice. They voted up north, they voted down here. We have cases where there have been petitions filed on dead people. And then the people taking the petition information have sworn that that person was alive and that's who it was. Those types of cases are cases that we can successfully prosecute, as Allison mentioned. In those cases, we move forward. But part of what a prosecutor has in reviewing the cases that are presented to him or her is to make a decision. Do we have a sufficient amount of evidence to go forward? And utilizing our discretion, if in fact we find that the person was, say, for example, in what was said before, told that they could vote, then I certainly think that that individual should not be held to answer for what they've done. And that is our job at our level, the prosecution level, to weed out those types of cases because we do further investigation. So, I mean, I guess I don't differ a whole lot from what Allison is saying with regard to that, but I think that there are people who are trapped in there. And I've seen some of this stuff on TV and everything else. And like I said, I've got some right now going on in the circuit where elderly people that are not of sound mind necessarily have voted both up north and down here. And it's more than one. But there's a reason for what they are. Another person was in bad health and they were doing mail-in ballots. And And she really wasn't able to make up a decision of whether she's doing the right thing or not. She thought she was. So I look at those and I say that we warned them when we told them now you can't do that. And we go ahead and close the case. It's as simple as that. We're not there putting everybody in jail. Let's don't just have a misconception of that. It's doing the right thing.
All right, thank you. They call this the lightning round, the next question. So if you can answer yes or no, that's the way we'd like you to start. But then if you want to expand a little bit, you still have 2 minutes if you want to use it entirely. And this question goes to candidate Bartlett. Roughly how many election fraud cases have you prosecuted or defended against in your career? I guess there's no yes or no answer.
Yeah, if that's yes, yeah, the yes or no doesn't work with that. But as to the defend, none. I've been a prosecutor all my life. I started when I came out of law school. I worked in the state attorney's office, and I've done my damnedest to stay here and do a good job to help the citizens of the community and try to keep crime down and our community safe. As to voting fraud cases, we've had, in my time that I can tell you, one actually resulted in a trial. It's been under 10 cases to where we've actually gone forward and prosecuted on voter fraud.
Okay. Candidate Miller?
None.
None?
I was going to say we're lawyers, and so I don't know if we can abide by a lightning round, but none.
No, I understand it. I set that up wrong. My apologies. So this next question goes to candidate Miller. During the George Floyd protests, we heard calls for equal justice, abolish the police, and support the blue. What, if anything, did you take away from these calls for action?
I really appreciated that the calls for action caused long overdue conversations about law enforcement reform. And I think what's frustrating in this circuit in Pinellas and Pasco counties for me is that that didn't translate into further conversation about state attorney reform or prosecutorial reform, right? And so we're now having this conversation pursuant to an election. And, you know, I think some folks watching may know this. The Tampa Bay Times reported that Mr. McCabe, our long-serving state attorney, last had an opponent in 1992. That was another Republican in a primary. The last time a Democrat ran was in 1964. And so for a lot of people in these communities, this race hasn't been on a ballot in their lifetimes. And so when I'm talking to people, a lot of people don't know the role of the state attorney. And so we had those conversations, and I think they were necessary and they were long overdue about the role of law enforcement, but it didn't translate into the conversation about prosecution, right? And so that's where there's an understanding about what the police do, and they get to decide who gets arrested. And I'm certainly not minimizing that, but the state attorney gets to decide who's charged, what sentence is recommended, if we offer that person diversion or pretrial intervention so the offender doesn't end up with a conviction, if we charge a child as an adult, if we seek the death penalty. And so some of these ideas of law and order and tough on crime, and I use air quotes because unfortunately, the party of my opponent have monopolized those to mean public safety when they don't at all equate to public safety. And everybody espousing them to mean public safety knows that that's the truth. And so I took from that it was the beginning of a much larger ball rolling.
All right, thank you. Candidate Bartlett, do you want me to read the question again?
I sure do, since I didn't think that answer was right there, but go ahead.
All right. The question is, during the George Floyd protests, we heard calls for equal justice, abolish the police, and support the blue. What, if anything, did you take away from these calls for action?
I think law enforcement in general took away from those calls for action a review of the process that they exercise and how some individuals are arrested and what's taken force and what consequences can potentially exist. And they took steps forward to make any improvements within their individual organizations. I know they have done that here locally to do what they could do to better the whole situation between everybody. But the idea of defunding the police is an idiocy. They've tried that in Baltimore. They've tried it in New York. They've tried it in Michigan. They've tried it in a lot of different states. And you know what happens? We go back to the lack of law and order. They go back and want to find their police officers. We've had an influx of police officers come into Pinellas County in the state of Florida from outside, from those cases, those places up north, and they've come here to be police officers because they got away from what they were facing up in those cities. And everybody that's experimented on it, the last time it was on the ballot, I believe it was on in Minnesota, and the voters defeated it. The same voters who called for it turned around and said, no, we're not going to do that. We are a system of laws. We need our law enforcement. We need good law enforcement to enforce those laws. Does everything go like we expect sometimes during arrest? No. People die sometimes during arrest due to circumstances. And it's ultimately going to be the state attorney's decision to make it, to determine if that is correct or not. But those are risks that you take. You get people who are high on drugs that are having serious issues with that, and they resist and fight, and certain things happen at times, and it can't be controlled. A medical examiner rules on what the cause of death is. But from the standpoint of defunding the police, that's crazy, and we pay dearly for it if we do it. And I have no intention to do anything that would support that in this community whatsoever.
Thank you. The next question goes to you, candidate Bartlett. The state attorney works closely with law enforcement. We're hearing more about the infiltration of white supremacy groups in law enforcement. What is or will be your process for alleviating public concerns about equal justice in police misconduct, abuse of power cases, by underrepresented communities?
Well, Rob, I have not heard anything about the influx of the white supremacy within the law enforcement areas at all. And I can tell you that if that were the case and that was being exerted on the people that were being arrested, then steps would have to be taken to do something to correct it. But I will tell you, I have great confidence in our law enforcement. I have great confidence in Sheriff Galtieri. I have great confidence in Sheriff Naco and the different chiefs of police. And I feel very confident in telling you that in our community that covers the 6th Judicial Circuit, those things are not happening, and then nor will they happen under those folks' watch.
All right, thank you. Candidate Miller, do you want me to read the question again, or do you want to go for it?
Sure, go ahead and read it again if you wouldn't mind, please.
All right, so the question is, the state attorney works closely with law enforcement. We're hearing more about the infiltration of white supremacy groups in law enforcement. What is or will be your process for alleviating public concerns about equal justice in police misconduct, abuse of power cases by underrepresented communities?
Right. And I want to be clear too, I do not support defunding law enforcement as well. So Mr. Bartlett and I are in agreement on that. I would disagree with his perception that there hasn't been white supremacy infiltrating law enforcement locally. I am somebody who's a career public defender, and so I have been on the front lines trying cases for the better part of 15 years. I have tried 4 capital cases in about a 15-month span while running for state attorney, which I wouldn't recommend, but I have just a lot of interaction with defendants, particularly our Black and brown defendants, as well as law enforcement, because I'm very much still in court, in the trenches, day in and day out. I intend to form a civil rights unit. We talked about the conviction integrity unit at the beginning of this conversation, and the conviction integrity unit would be part of a larger civil rights unit. And the civil rights unit would also have lawyers specifically dedicated to investigating law enforcement. And I'm not out to get police. I'm out to hold everyone accountable at the same rates and standards. And so law enforcement, I don't want you to feel like you're under attack if I get elected. I also don't think anyone is deserving of a free pass just by virtue of the employment that they hold. And so the civil rights unit will be a somewhat autonomous unit from the state attorney's office under my leadership and will report directly to me, because I agree there has to be a partnership between the assistant state attorneys prosecuting and law enforcement, but we also bear a responsibility to the community to investigate law enforcement and make sure we're weeding out those bad apples.
Thank you. The next question goes to you, candidate Miller. This question is, last year, our circuit court led the state in sending teens to adult criminal court, with teens charged as adults 110 times. Nearly every time, this was at the sole discretion of the state attorney's office. If you are faced with a case so egregious you believe adult sanctions are necessary, will you commit to asking a judge to review the case? And this includes we'd like you to answer yes or no to this question. Before you
But I
give
got
us
2 minutes
longer.
still. Yes, I will commit to asking a judge to consider waiving a child into adult court if the circumstances warrant it, is the short answer. The longer answer is you have touched on a much larger conversation, and juvenile justice is one of the main reasons that I decided to run for state attorney and reforming what is supposed to look like juvenile justice in this circuit. As you said, according to the Department of Juvenile Justice, the Sixth Circuit, Pinellas and Pasco counties, charged more children as adults than any other circuit in this state last year, which includes circuits like Miami-Dade. Miami-Dade's population is nearly 3 million people. And as you said, we're just over 1.5 million. And so certainly we're not the largest circuit. We're not the most crime ridden, but we are certainly charging the most children as adults. And I believe 100% of the children were charged as adults at the discretion of the state attorney. I don't believe they asked the court for any input and any waiver hearings, which was again a disparity between our circuit and other circuits in this state. And I think also more poignant is to note that Pinellas County's population is only about 11% Black. But again, according to the Department of Juvenile Justice, 75% of the children we charged as adults last year as a circuit were Black. And so this is going to sound like one of those kind of obvious statements. I don't intend to violate the civil rights of the defendants I prosecute, including children. And so it seems like we can't prosecute children as adults without doing it with tremendous racial disparity. I don't think putting children in prison serves to make this community safer. All of the evidence shows that a child put in prison once released is more likely to commit a crime of violence than if you had not put the child in prison. That is a statistic that is so obvious, it makes me want to say, no duh. I think we bear an ethical and moral responsibility to rehabilitate children, and I will use my office as the state attorney to do so to the best of my ability. I will review every case on a case-by-case basis, and certainly there are going to be circumstances which necessitate a court's involvement.
Thank you. Thank you. Candidate Bartlett, you want me to reread the question?
Yes.
Okay, so the question is, last year, our circuit led the state in sending teens to adult criminal court, with teens charged as adults 110 times. The time, this was at the sole discretion of the state attorney's office. If you are faced with a case so egregious you believe adult sanctions are necessary, will you commit to asking a judge to review the case and include a yes or no answer?
I would say yes. However, that being said, I have a record of 110 cases last year, the last time, not 2021 year, I believe. And let me explain. There's 2 ways that you become prosecuted as an adult. Number 1, you've committed a violent felony crime that's so egregious that the act of what you did in and of itself represents the actions of an an adult versus a juvenile. That would include rape, murder, armed robbery, firearm offenses. And for example, Officer Crawford several years ago was killed in the city of St. Petersburg by a 16-year-old boy who shot him 5 times with a firearm. That individual was a person who Officer Crawford had helped in his younger years as a child and tried to lead him in the path of doing right things. It cost him his life. He died 30 days before he was to retire. Those are violent crimes. Those decisions are easy to make. You charge them as adults. The second way is when they've been in the juvenile system and they've had the benefit of all the different programs that exist. And I'm going to tell you right now, in my opinion, the juvenile system is not equipped to handle a lot of the children that go through there. And that's part of the problem. But in any event, that's another story. So those kids that keep reoffending and reoffending in spite of all the help and guidance that they've been given in the juvenile system have to be dealt with by as adults. That's the only way to get their attention. Now, of those charged, we had 3,500 cases last year. 1,950 of those cases were actually filed. The rest were closed for diversion programs. The 110 people that were direct filed represented 5.6%. Those cases are small when you look at the numbers that way, but they all have done things that warranted taking care of doing that. We started a prolific juvenile offender program to try to focus on the juveniles and give us more strength to do what we need to do in that respect to cut those numbers back.
Okay, thank you. Candidate Bartlett, this is your turn to go first. Do you believe as state attorney that you have a duty to not just uphold the Florida Constitution, but also the US Constitution? And we're asking for a yes or no, and then your answer.
The oath I took was for the Florida and the US constitutions. That's my answer.
Okay. Candidate Miller?
I agree with Mr. Bartlett. I have a duty to uphold both the Florida and the United States constitutions.
Okay. Next question is for candidate Miller. How would you implement transparency and accountability regarding professional ethics in your office?
Regarding specifically professional ethics. Well, I'm working with a group now called the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators, and I would like them to be involved at the ground floor and then going forward. I believe in transparency and accountability. I intend to deliver on the promises that I make in the course of this candidacy, and if I don't, you should vote me out of office. And so part of that, and why I like the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators group is that there are certain metrics they use to measure prosecutorial success in the business, right? Things like how long does it take to get a charge from charge to conviction. But this group also polls in the community to measure what the community think marks, the makes of a successful prosecution or a successful prosecutor. Part of that data will be measuring racial parity at all angles where prosecutorial discretion is afforded. Things like who we charge, what sentence we recommend, if we offer diversion, if we charge a child as an adult, if we seek the death penalty, and all of that data measuring both successful prosecution, as well as the racial parity will be available on my website on a dashboard.
Okay, thank you. Candidate Bartlett?
Yeah, better give it to me again.
Okay, so the question is, how would you implement transparency and accountability regarding professional ethics in your office?
I believe if those issues exist, they would reveal themselves during the course of our ordinary office practice. So as that goes, I have no intent to change anything the way it's being done in there. I require the utmost ethical obligations of all the assistants, and not a day goes by that somebody doesn't have a question about saying, what should I do here in this particular situation? And they have guidance to help them with that. And I'm comfortable with the decisions that they make. Going back to the issue of racial equality, I want to make it clear that when we proceed on our cases, we don't go find them. The cases come to us from law enforcement, and they come to law enforcement because somebody committed a crime. When that case comes in the office, we file based on the crime and the criminal history of the individual. We don't focus on race, nor do we care, because that's not our job. We're dealing with it as the person. So I need that to be straight, to be clear to everybody about that. Secondly, we are doing something right because our crime stats that came out last from FDLE showed a drop in crime in Pinellas County of 15.7%, the highest in the Tampa Bay area of 7 counties, and then 9.9% in Pasco. So obviously the way we're handling our cases and what we're doing is working.
All right, thank you. This next question goes to you, candidate Bartlett. Will you accept the results of your race, whether you win or lose?
Of my race? Yes. If I lose, I lose. If I win, I win.
Candidate Miller.
Am I missing something?
Well, I think he's asking, because some say the president didn't acknowledge that he lost, and so I think you and I are both saying yes, we will acknowledge if we win or lose.
Yeah, that was kind of a really not. I mean, who came up with that?
Okay. Next question. This is for candidate Miller. What is or would be your office's position as to public concerns over predictive policing policies?
Well, I think that pertains specifically to the Pasco Sheriff's Office. And most recently, when I was at the Public Defender's Office, I had to resign to run. But when I was at the PD's office, I was supervising both of our offices in Pasco County, an office in Newport Richey and Dade City. And in that role, I served on a Pasco coalition to shed light on and end the sheriff's use of predictive policing. It is harmful. It targets children. It targets children more so if they are a member of a minority community. And I actually spoke with some of the senior staff at the state attorney's office about the predictive policing program after I had met with Sheriff Naco, because he kept saying to me, we're doing this to try to prevent future school shootings. And as somebody who's done capital defense in this state for as long as I have, I can say unequivocally what they're doing is not in any way going to prevent school shootings. And if it actually leads to arrest, I think the state attorney's office would have difficulty prosecuting it because of the gross constitutional violations that are being committed by law enforcement. And so I said to some of the senior staff, I think y'all need to talk to Mr. McCabe, who was the state attorney at the time, to let the sheriff know we got to stop this because we're never going to be able to prosecute these things if we actually arrest anybody. And unfortunately, before that conversation could take place, Mr. McCabe passed away, and I'm now running against Mr. Bartlett. I can't underscore enough. And I think too, it bears worth mentioning that both the school board as well as the sheriff's office are under investigation by the Department of Justice for this predictive policing and their repeat offender programs because they're violative of children's privacy rights. And so I see my role as making sure the Constitution is enforced.
All right, candidate Bartlett, the same question. What would be your office's position as to public concerns over predictive policing policies?
Well, as I said before, I have a great deal of confidence in both the sheriffs in Pasco and in Pinellas counties, and I don't tell them how to do their job, and they don't tell me how to do mine. If our paths cross by way of cases that come from them where these issues exist, where there are problems, where I feel like rights have been violated, then of course I certainly would be assertive and make sure that those wrongs were righted and that process and that practice would be stopped. I think what we were referring to, Allison, was the intelligence-led policing that was done in Pasco County several years ago. And to my knowledge, that practice has stopped at this particular point in time, but it was designed to identify the individuals who had issues that would characterize them as potentially being a problem in other matters beyond the school area. But again, he's the sheriff. I'm the state attorney. He doesn't tell me what to do. I don't tell him what to do unless it affects me doing my job. And then I have an obligation to come forward if it does. And I have an obligation to make an effort to get that changed. But we haven't reached that point yet in our mind. Now, there are people who think that we have, and they see a lot of things. They talk about victims as defendants, and they talk about defendants as victims. But this isn't that situation that I see in this particular thing.
I think we're down to our last 4 questions. I just want to remind you too that we'll have 2 minutes for you to kind of wrap up and maybe deal with any loose ends as we go through this debate. The next question is for candidate Bartlett. What is or will be the protocol to ensure that Spanish-speaking, non-English-speaking domestic violence victims get victim advocacy?
Well, I'll tell you, Rob, those individuals that are victims generally in the forefront are dealt with by law enforcement agencies. As far as I know, most all the law enforcement agencies have the ability to have an interpreter available to them if they need to have the assistance of an interpreter. I will tell you that I have met with Lariana Forsyth, who is the CASA person, and she is very soon going to open up what they call the Family Justice Center in St. Petersburg, which will be a pilot program designed to help battered women to specifically fight domestic violence. And how that program is going to work, we've already stationed prosecutors down there at our office, and the victims will be brought in and the cases will be investigated within a very short period of time after the incident occurring. And we're hoping to achieve a more successful result in the domestic violence issues. And as a result, she has on hand interpreters that can be brought in to handle any of the Spanish speaking issues or any other languages that may be confronting us by way of the domestic violence information. So we'll deal with it as it goes and use it to help us to determine what the facts of the cases are and to go forward and help those individuals who have been victims of domestic violence. It's very high on my list to continue to do that. This reestablishing the Family Justice Center is the first trial basis in the state of Florida, and it's going to be wildly successful, and we're doing everything we can in our power to make sure that works.
Thank you. Candidate Miller, what would you do? What will be your protocol to ensure that Spanish-speaking, non-English speaking domestic violence victims get victim advocacy?
We are going to have far more robust victim advocacy, including advocates that work for the state attorney's office who are native Spanish speakers. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. I think that perhaps Mr. Bartlett and I agree that there needs to be reform in how we prosecute domestic violence. When I say there are particular areas that motivated me to want to run, this is one of them. I was a victim of violent crime, both as a teenager and in college. And I began working with fellow victims of violent crime, as well as now next of kin of homicide victims through the local diocese, I'm Catholic, as well as the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I certainly appreciate that Mr. Bartlett champions himself, the victim's rights guy, but a lot of the leadership of these victim advocacy groups support me. The head of the Pinellas Coalition to End Domestic Violence, the day I announced I was running, sent me a message that I've kept because I hold it very dear, and the message reads, "Thank God you're running. That office has done irreparable harm to victims of domestic violence for decades." And I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, it's because we don't exercise empathy and compassion to people who have been victimized, and instead we re-victimized and re-traumatized those people. I think in order to successfully prosecute domestic violence, we have to provide people with stability, and housing instability is one of the greatest thresholds that prohibits a victim of domestic violence from feeling comfortable in pursuing prosecution. We leave victims of partner violence with an impossible Sophie's choice to either prosecute or to end up potentially homeless and homeless with children. And so unless we're willing to really tackle the underlying issues at play, we are never going to be able to successfully prosecute domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking like we should be.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question goes to candidate Miller. What is your position on citizen review boards to review your office's prosecuting procedures?
I agree with them. Specifically, I intend to form a shareholder group. I'm somebody who's been a student of criminal justice, both as a victim and a victim advocate and as a defense attorney. I am somebody who has studied criminal justice for decades, but that doesn't mean that I have all of the answers. And I oftentimes think that white people can be really presumptuous about trying to fix communities that we've never been a part of. And so I am inviting shareholders from all of the communities in Pinellas and Pasco to join me. Somebody said to me, a colleague with the Southern Poverty Law Center, that those impacted by policies are usually the least involved in their enactment. And again, it was one of those really obvious statements that had a profound impact on me. And so I want to have this shareholder group to get input from the communities that I and Mr. Bartlett have never been a part of. And so I'm not just asking for your vote and your support, I'm asking for people to join me in the reform that is necessary. And I'm certainly going to focus on historically marginalized communities. But I think that as part of that group, I will seek input, to your point, as a citizen review board, I will seek input from that group as to our policies and procedures, which doesn't say that which doesn't, mean that that group has the end all be all say in what we do. But I think it's important to receive input from the community in how we enact policy going forward.
All right, thank you. Candidate Bartlett, what is your position on the citizen review boards to review your office's prosecuting procedures?
I have no plans to implement such a policy. We do the best we can do And if we have problems and cases that we are presented with, we deal with those problems. If citizens have a problem, I would hope that they would share that with us. I think that I have a group of experienced prosecutors, long-term prosecutors who have done a very, very good job in the office, and they do a very good job in the office going forward. And it is certainly my intention to support them in any and every way I can. And if there are doing things that aren't improper, then that will be dealt with by the various different options. But for having a citizen group come and make a decision as to whether or not we did the right thing in prosecuting a case, I'm sorry, but I just do not think that is the right thing to do, nor do I think that we have the time to spare to do that in the office in light of the current conditions that exist with the post-COVID shortages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and I might add also that we have began a program of data collection. They started one within the state. The legislature proposed that we'd have the most accurate data available to make data-driven decisions on how we do things. And the Sixth Circuit, the state attorney's office, was the first to volunteer to go forward. And that is a program has been implemented, and they're in the process right now, as we speak, of gathering data, which is going to tell us a lot more about some of these indiscretions that is alleged that exist, and give us an idea of which direction things are going and the reason why they are going in that direction based on the data-driven information. So there's no attempt to cover any of this stuff up. We're very open about it, and we plan on hoping to use that data information to better the office.
All right, candidate Bartlett, the next question is for you. What is or would be your policy on transparency regarding, and we talked about transparency earlier, what would be your policy on transparency regarding publishing the state attorney's office's statistical data on demographics, charge, conviction rates, appellate reversals, and the funds allocated?
Well, I believe a lot of that, Rob, is going to be available now when this data transparency program gets up and running full swing. So I think it's going to be there. I think it's a governmental office. I think people are entitled to know what our win conviction is, what our loss rate is, what the cases that we're filing are. That's data will be all available out there for people to know. And just because the data may show something that shows a proclivity to filing more of this type of case or that type of case, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is correct and it needs to be changed. What it means is, yes, the information is correct, but that situation may be more significant in our community than it is in other communities. Therefore, it affects more people who commit those types of offenses. You may have areas of low minority areas where people, quite frankly, in the United States, studies have shown that people of color are more likely to become victims of crimes than are white people. And that's a fact. And in polling, 80% of the people in the minority communities have said they want to see the same level of policing, if not more, because they want safe communities. And that's really what this is all about, is safe communities. It's not about black or white. It's about the safe communities. So within their communities, if they're the victims of crimes, those people that are committing those crimes need to be held to answer. We need to have people come forward and become witnesses and help us prosecuting those cases to help the situation get better. Too often we have murder scenes where you have 20 people standing in a group and nobody saw anything. And it's happened in a lot of the minority communities. It makes it very difficult to go forward and stop the crime that exists. The children are running around with guns, shooting each other like it's a video game, and it's got to be stopped.
All right, candidate Bartlett, thank you. Candidate Miller, the same question. What would be your policy on transparency regarding publishing the state attorney's office statistical data on demographics, charge, conviction rates, appellate reversals, and the funds allocated?
I think I already addressed this too. We are going to measure all of that. All of it's going to be publicly available on a dashboard on my website. But I do want to touch on something Mr. Bartlett said. I agree. Nobody is asking for anything extra. Our Black and brown communities are asking for the same thing as everybody else, to be respected and protected. And so if they're not willing to participate in your prosecutions, ask yourself why that is. It's because they don't trust you and trust the criminal justice system, and that starts at the top. And so I certainly think a part of that is making ourselves more transparent and acknowledging and owning our misdeeds and correcting them moving forward.
The last question from us is this one, and it goes to candidate Miller first. What are some of the issues that you most definitely disagree with your opponent on? And I know we've touched on some of them already, but what are the most definite issues that you disagree with your opponent on?
I'd like to think that at its fundamental core, we don't disagree on the overall objective, excuse me. I think we both agree the goal is to keep people safe. I believe that about Mr. Bartlett. I think, though, that when I heard him say when he was appointed that the thing that makes his office the most effective is the lack of change is really telling, because we have learned a lot about criminal justice over the last 40, 50, 60 years. I find it hard to believe that there would be any industry, if we were doing it now the same way we were doing it 40, 43 years ago, that we would say that's a good thing. And so I too, the reason I'm running is because I heard Mr. Bartlett say the thing that makes the office the most effective is the lack of change. And so I haven't met many people in the criminal justice system or over the course of this campaign, regardless of party affiliation, when I talk to them, who think the criminal justice system is working well, right? And so I think and it's not even really Bruce, but I think what's being promoted is this idea that in order to promote public safety, you got to lock everybody up. The only way to hold people accountable is to put them in jail or to put them in prison. And frankly, if incarcerating people made us safer, this country and this state with its 90,000 incarcerated inmates in the prison system would be one of the safest states in the country. And that's just not true. And I think it's so interesting that Mr. Bartlett mentioned the fact that crime rates dropped last year. Convictions were also at a historical low. And I think that so supports what I'm saying is that you can hold people accountable without putting everybody in the prison system. And so I think our objectives are the same, but I think Mr. Bartlett has made his position clear that you're not going to teach an old dog new tricks, and we need a more effective way to keep people safe.
Candidate Miller, thank you very much. Candidate Bartlett, what areas do you disagree most with your opponent?
Probably most of them, all of them. And what she says about the change, we have changed in that office. Since I've been in that office, I've made significant changes with a lot of things that have brought it back into the modern days. And we continue to do so. I've promoted women and minorities to positions of supervision higher in the office. I've made changes on how we conduct business in the office. We have more deferred prosecution programs for juveniles than any other county in the state, with the exception of Miami, and we flip-flop back and forth. And we are very, very aggressive about using those for our children. So it's not about putting everybody in jail, but what it is about is there's a point in time where you have to make a decision about a person. How many times is that individual going to be allowed to steal a car? How many times is that individual going to be allowed to break into your house or somebody else's house? And stop blaming the victim for the house being unlocked and to allow this guy to go in and steal. How about we blame the guy that goes in and steals and does that stuff? And you have to be aggressive about your approach. But we have specialty courts, we have veterans court, we have drug court, recognizing people make mistakes. I just started a drop program where you have DUI first-time offenders have the opportunity to get out of it with a reckless if they meet certain conditions, because I know how telling that can be to them in life to have a DUI. We utilize those programs. I was instrumental in having the court system set up a mental health court in Pinellas County, and that's going to be implemented next month, hopefully. And it was focusing on those people that have those issues. So the whole idea is to defer them away from the criminal justice system. But you reach a point where people don't adhere to that, and they're back doing it and creating victims, causing crimes, and you have to put those people in jail.
Thank you. Candidate Miller, it's time for our closing 2-minute statements, and you're first on our list. So what would you like to finish with in this form?
Sure. I think we've touched on a lot of this, but I am somebody who has been embedded in the criminal justice system for a very long time. I walked into a robbery in progress in a Walgreens when I was 14 years old, and the cashier was so nervous she couldn't overcome the fail safes to get the cash register open. And so the robber walked to all the patrons of the store and held us at gunpoint and took our money and our wallets. I was raped in college. And I'm going to be honest, I don't like talking about these things, right? I don't routinely share them with strangers, but I think it is critical for people to know who I am and why I am doing this. And so beyond being a victim, I then started working with victims of violent crime. It's morphed into working with next of kin of homicide victims by virtue of what I do. I am a career public defender. I am board certified in criminal trial law. I'm considered an expert by the Florida Bar in what I do. I'm designated by rule of criminal procedure to defend capital cases, which very few lawyers bear that distinction. And most importantly, beyond my experiences and my professional credentials, I'm a mom. I'm the mother to a beautiful little girl. Her name is Annie. I live with my husband and daughter, and my parents, who are in their 70s, live about a mile from us. They did not always. They moved here once I had a daughter. And so the idea that I would do anything to make these counties less safe is absurd, and it's offensive. What I do is for and because of my daughter, and my sole obligation in this world is to protect her. And I want to assume the responsibility of protecting everyone else's children in these counties, which I know is a huge undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you. Candidate Bartlett?
I was born and raised in St. Petersburg, and I have made it my home. I married my high school sweetheart. I've raised my two children here. I've been active in the community, and I started at the state attorney's office when I graduated from law school. And as a result, I've been there ever since. Started at the bottom and I've worked my way up the top, and I've gone through different iterations of the state attorney's office. I've gone through a different boss at the state attorney's office over the years, but I poured my heart and soul into that job. And it has been the theme was to keep the community safe, to make this like it was when I grew up as a kid, where I could ride the bus when I was 10 years old downtown St. Petersburg and never have my parents worry about my safety, where our houses were unlocked, where our cars were unlocked. You didn't worry about things like that. Yes, that is in the past, but you always want to bring it to that level if you can, so other people can raise their families in this community and make it a safe place for them to do that. I suggest, Allison, perhaps you look back at your what your positions were on things when you first started running for state attorney's office, and it has changed significantly. Back then, you were talking about defunding the police. You were talking about all the bad things that the state attorney does, and you were talking about all the good things that you were going to be able to do. And the reason that you got into this was because of this robbery that you were involved in. Well, as I understand it, you were 14 years old, you were with your father, and there were several other people in that store with you at the time. It wasn't like you were singled out when this robbery took place. So if that's your motivating factor, why aren't you there now being a prosecutor? Yes, you did interview at the office. Well, you know what? We weren't the only state attorney's office, Allison. You could have gone on if you had the dream to do all this stuff. You didn't do it. You didn't pursue any of that stuff. That's not dedication. That's you flip your personality to fit whatever's going on around you right now. And if anybody goes back and looks at what you said all from the beginning of your campaign, we'll know that to be the truth.
I wish we had more time because I think we've left some issues on the table. But I want to thank both of you for participating in the debate. And I think I noticed that there were some areas in which you agreed. So thank you for that. And I want to thank everybody who was sponsoring this debate. And a recorded version of this forum will be posted with closed captioning on the League of Women Voters St. Petersburg area Facebook page and the YouTube channel in a few days. And please remember to register to vote by October 11th. The election will be on November 8th. And if you vote by mail, it must be received by your county supervisor of election before 7 p.m. on election day. Thank you, candidates, for a great debate.